Hi Year 11, this is part 2 of the revision lecture on the Cold War. Remember, this is my slightly budget version because it's me and an iPhone, no camera stand, and now an extension cable because my phone is running out of battery, so I'm literally stretched trying to do this for you. So I'm going to do slides 7 to 13 on the PowerPoint, which remember you can find on Show My Homework. I'm going to look at the first Berlin crisis in 1948, a little bit on the arms race, the Hungarian uprising, the second Berlin crisis and the Cold War. Just a reminder, you cannot rely completely on this lecture for your revision because I cannot go in absolute detail on all of the events. But using this, the revision PowerPoint, the revision guides that you have, your exercise book, everything like that combined should help. This is designed to help turn your knowledge into understanding so you can answer the questions confidently in your exam. So, starting with the first Berlin crisis in 1948, please make sure you've watched the first revision lecture to help this because I can't go back and cover everything again. But in 1948, it was at a time when relations and tensions between the two sides was really building up. Germany was divided into 4 zones, as we know, and the Western zones called their zones Trizonia. The 3 kind of nations eventually joined together, creating a clear divide between East and West Germany. If you see on slide 7, it will show you a map of that. But Berlin was still a problem. It was in the Eastern Bloc. And Stalin was very aware that at the time the Soviet Union were kind of on the ropes, if you like, and he wanted to demonstrate to not only his people but America that the Soviet Union meant business. He wanted Berlin to be part of Eastern Germany. He didn't like having American, British and French people in Berlin. They were in their side. He was worried that that might cause like capitalism to spread into East Germany out from East Berlin. And also it'd be great propaganda value for him to take Berlin, the capital of the old Germany, and take it as part of the communist bloc. So he decided to block all of the roads into Berlin in a kind of an attempt to make the people on in West Berlin leave. And he also knew, because Truman had stated in the Truman Doctrine that he'd help any country under threat, he knew that it was going to force America to act. And he could really see how serious America were at defending capitalism. So he blocked the roads. It was called the Berlin Blockade. And in response, America, again, they kind of knew that it was difficult. They didn't really want to go to war. They'd just been at war. War was not popular. But equally, he could not leave Berlin. He just said in the Truman Doctrine he'd help anyone who's under threat. And by not helping, he would appear incredibly weak. So they carried out the Berlin Airlift, which took place in 1948 and 1949, where they flew supplies from the west of Germany into West Berlin to keep the people in West Berlin fed and alive. And he also wanted to see whether Stalin would be brave enough to shoot down or stop one of his planes getting there, knowing that if Stalin did that, it would give America an opportunity to invade and not seem like the aggressors. So it put Stalin in a really tricky position. So he played the waiting game, but it lasted for just over a year, the airlift. And then Stalin eventually conceded he wasn't going to be able to win. What it meant that Berlin was going to stay divided in the eastern part of Germany. America and the West responded by creating the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. It made West Germany an official country. And the Soviet Union responded again by creating the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, even though America and the west of Germany didn't actually recognise it as an official country, not till much later in the 1970s. Nonetheless, it once again cemented that divide between the two sides. And I suppose it was a small defeat for Stalin and a bit of a moral victory here for Truman. But by now, really, 1948, definitely, relations between the two sides were particularly bad. I said in the last lecture that NATO was created in 1949, and the Soviets did the same again. They responded by creating the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And that was an agreement between the communist countries that they would support each other. It had its own army, and that would be used to solve any disputes which happened in the Eastern Bloc, which we'll see later with things like the Hungarian uprising and the Czechoslovakian Prague Spring. So two Europes had been created. So you can find information on the Warsaw Pact on slide 8. Moving on to slide 9, there's some information about the arms race. A few important dates to note. America developed an atomic bomb in 1945, as we know, and the Soviet Union developed their own in 1949. So a level playing field was established in terms of the weapons they had. In 1952, America tested a hydrogen bomb, which is, roughly 1,000 to 10,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. The Soviet Union tested their own one in 1953. And then in 1957, both sides tested ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which meant essentially they could attack each other from their own countries. They could be fired a long way, and they didn't need to fly planes over each other's country to drop nuclear or atomic weapons. That's important to bear in mind, those dates. So when you look at any of the events, if you know that things happened after 1953, for example, both sides had nuclear capabilities. There was also a change in leadership. 1953, also a really important date, because it was the death of Stalin. Stalin was replaced, it was 3 years later, by Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev believed in something called peaceful coexistence, or so he said. He thought Stalin's methods were too aggressive and put the Soviet Union at risk. So he wanted a peaceful coexistence between the two sides. That didn't mean that he liked capitalism, but he basically wanted America to stick to themselves and the Soviet Union to be able to stick to themselves as well. At the same time, a year earlier, Eisenhower became the president of America. He was an ex-army general, quite famous in World War II. And as a military man, he was kind of elected with the promise that he would be very, very firm against communism. And again, that was going to cause more tension between the two sides, as we'll see later. Moving on to slide 10 then, Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence, this idea that he wanted to be more peaceful, was going to be put to test with the Hungarian uprising in 1956. And this is where Nagy comes into play. You might remember him from our lessons. Hungary was a country which had had those supposed free elections to become communist, but by 1956 started to experience the real problems with communism. There was riots over food and fuel shortages, and troops basically sent in to restore order, and then Khrushchev places Nagy in charge, thinking that Nagy, as a loyal communist, would help restore order. However, Nagy introduces some reforms into Hungary. He places non-communists in the government, I suppose probably in an attempt to try and rejuvenate the economy a little bit. And he also releases some political prisoners, people who'd been sent to prison by the communists for having kind of like capitalist ideas. He also announces that Hungary were to leave the Warsaw Pact. And by this time, alarm bells are ringing for Khrushchev. He cannot allow Hungary to leave, because if Hungary is allowed to leave, other countries in the Eastern Bloc also might decide that they want to leave as well. Nagy, I suppose, also thought he was going to get help from America. The Truman Doctrine stated that any nation who wanted to leave communism or who was under threat from communism could rely on help from the USA. So Nagy probably had a bit of belief here that America would either send money or troops or something to help protect them. Khrushchev orders the army of the Soviet Union to invade Hungary, and 1,000 tanks roll into Budapest. About 20,000 people are injured, and if you remember, Nagy is rounded up and eventually he's executed. And Nagy's kind of hope for America to intervene and support them didn't happen, and it put them in a really, really difficult position. I suppose for Truman it was tricky because Hungary is deep into the Eastern Bloc, and he knows in 1956 that the USSR have got a nuclear bomb, a hydrogen bomb, sorry. Khrushchev probably realises at this stage that the Truman Doctrine, although was a threat from America that they would help any country who wanted to move away from communism, was not necessarily always going to be put into play. And it probably sent shockwaves to other nations in the Eastern Bloc, any country that was thinking we could follow Hungary's lead and try and have an uprising, that perhaps they would not get the help from America, which they thought. So probably a moral victory for Khrushchev there. Not ideal for Eisenhower. I think I might have said Truman earlier, but I meant the Truman Doctrine. Not ideal for Eisenhower, and this really demonstrated Khrushchev's strength. Also, Khrushchev, who said that he believed in peaceful coexistence, had proven to the Soviet people that he was not someone to be reckoned with. Moving on to slide 11 then, the Second Berlin Crisis. I've named this the Second Berlin Crisis. It doesn't really say it in the book, but it can get confusing with the Berlin blockade. But we're in 1958, so a few years later. And because of the terrible conditions in the communist state, people were pouring through kind of Europe into East Germany and into East Berlin, because they knew that if they got to East Berlin, they could cross the border into West Berlin and from there catch a plane or a train and get into West Germany and then have, I suppose, freedom, if you like, in Western Europe. So 3 million people had crossed the border. And again, this was awful for Khrushchev because it looked terrible. 3 million people escaping communism. And the propaganda value in that for the Americans is great because they can kind of use that to show how terrible communism actually is. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try and go through this, but you will need to use your revision guides to help you. But Khrushchev creates something called a Berlin Ultimatum, and an ultimatum is kind of like a last chance, if you like. If you do this, this will happen. And he demanded East Germany should be recognised as a nation, Berlin should be a free city, to which the West were outraged, because clearly if Berlin became a free city and it's placed inside East Germany, clearly Khrushchev would then take it over and it would become part of the communist bloc. So the ultimatum meant that America now had to respond, and if it wasn't correct, it could lead to a war. So there's a series of summits. There's the Geneva Summit in May 1959, where there was no agreement made on what to do with Berlin. There was a Camp David Summit in September 1955, which is where famously Khrushchev visited America, and there's some great pictures of him at Disneyland. But the Berlin Ultimatum was withdrawn there, so he took away the threat that if Berlin wasn't made a free city, there would be trouble. There was the Paris Summit in May 1960, and this was particularly bad one for America, because just as this summit happened, the USSR shot down an American spy plane, and the pilot, Gary Powers, admitted that he was a spy, even though the Americans tried to say it was a weather plane. And that looked really, really bad because it showed that lack of trust that the Americans were spying on the Soviet Union. There was the Vienna Summit in 1961 when JFK had just become the president. And again, they tried to resolve the problem with Berlin, but they couldn't do it. And Kennedy was also under pressure to perform at this summit because it was just after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which I'm going to do in the next part of the lecture. But Kennedy had just been embarrassed, and he knew that Khrushchev probably had the upper hand. So those summits happen, and there's still no kind of agreement of what to do with Berlin. And with everything else that's been going on in the world, tensions were at an all-time high. So Khrushchev responded in a way which I suppose wasn't aggressive, but it was decisive. And this is where they built the Berlin Wall in 1961. He knew the only way to stop the flood of refugees going from the east to the west was to build a physical barrier. And that wall was built firstly with barbed wire and then created into a permanent concrete and barbed wire wall. What this did for the communists was stop the flood of people going into the west. So it solved that problem. What it also did was showed that any kind of relationship and consultation between the two sides was over. There is a physical barrier dividing them now through the middle of Europe, and in this case through the middle of Berlin. It showed the failings of all the previous summits and any kind of meetings and agreements that they tried to do. They were futile and nothing really worked. It symbolised the difference, as I said, between the two sides. But actually what it did do, I suppose positively, was reduce the chance of a war with Berlin. I suppose now the Berlin question was over, it was clear that it was going to be split into two sides. So there was no reason really to have a conflict about it in the future. So you could argue that it actually reduced tension ever so slightly. However, I suppose those years and months leading up to the building of the Berlin Wall were certainly a time when atomic or nuclear war seemed quite likely. Okay, so that's the end of the second part of the revision lecture. Have a look at part 3, where we're going to look at the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you.